So I think we can start. And good evening to all our guests, both online and in presence. Today, it is my turn to introduce you to our 14th appointment with the FeBinars, the talks organized in the framework of the ERC project FeBo here in Trento. The FeBinars are a kind of think tank of our project, and as many of you know, FeBo aims to investigate the dynamics preceding to the management of the internal and the external borderlands of Greek federal states. Our focus is on a big question: how can border wars be avoided? And in connection with this, how do the federalization processes contribute to the stabilization of border areas? We need to work on a number of key issues in the current debate, including the linearity of borders, the porosity of borders, and the capacity of the COENA to implement border management policies. In order to gain a comprehensive understanding of these matters, we apply a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up. As far as we are interested in border management cultures, the relevance of cross-border activities, the balances of power. The literature on these topics is enormous and still in a state of flux. And for these reasons, we have invited and will be inviting in the next 2 years experts on these subjects. Members of the FeBo team are the PI Elena Franchi, Rebecca Massinelli, Sebastian Schaff, and Roy Van Wyk, and me. Since intra-federal and extra-federal borders need to be investigated from various research perspectives and with different questions, we organized 2 different series of FeBinars. The one addressing issues concerning the management of internal borders, entitled The Management of Internal Borders by Federal States. The other focusing on external borders and cross-borders activities, entitled Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern. Both series have been inaugurated by the lecture delivered by Hans Beck, University of Münster on March 7, 2023, with a case studies on ancient Boeotia, involving both intra-federal and federal borders. Once again, Boeotia will be the focus of our 2 days lecture that is delivered by Donnellan in the framework of the webinar series entitled The Management of Internal Borders by Federal States. This series deals with problems of intra-federal borders and borderlands. Did border management policies aim at a peaceful coexistence? To what extent balance of power and stability were an objective of Greek federal authorities? These and other questions presuppose other thorny issues like what borders are we talking about? The borders of polis, of districts, between polis and between districts, how the borders are defined, and which actors are involved in this redefinition. How much does this affect the internal balance of power of the community itself and the internal balance of power of the koinon of which the community is part? Which is the impact of intra-federal networks, either for informal or institutionalized, on the cohesion and stability of the koinon? Or, in other words, to what extent the political development of a federal body is affected by earlier cultural exchanges and negotiation that resurface in communal memories and identities. Our guest today is Donnellan, lecturer in classical Greek archaeology at the University of Melbourne. She was previously assistant professor of classic archaeology at the University of Aarhus and Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Amsterdam, Dorothea Schlotzer Fellow at the Archäologisches Institut of the Georg August Universität Göttingen, and Fellow of the Belgian American Educational Foundation at the Department of Classics of the University of Chicago. She obtained her PhD title at the University of Ghent in 2012 and was awarded with the Babesh Bifunk Award for the best scholarly paper in the field of archaeological studies in 2011. Amongst Liv's main research interests are the Greek colonization of southern Italy and the Black Sea, or Greek apoikiai to use anemic terminology, but also urbanization and urban architecture, the ancient economy, and the application of network theory in archaeology. Liv currently conducts a fieldwork in Greece, Haliartos in Boeotia, and in Italy in the plain of Gioia Tauro in Calabria. Her works include a major scientific effort like archaeological network and social interaction, published by Routledge in 2020, and two important miscellanies for the research on ancient Greek apoikiai, like the volumes conceptualizing early colonization and context of early colonization 2016. She's also author of several papers, and among them, I wish to mention the numerous contributions concerning the archaeology of southern Italy, Naxos, Zancle, Kyme, Locris Epizerifirio, and others. But I stop here now, but not without mentioning our next speaker, who will be Adolfo Domínguez Monedero, the University Autónoma of the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid on June 6th, with a lecture entitled Internal and External Borders in Epirus. So we'll move from Boeotia to Epirus next time. Now I give the floor to Liv for her presentation, and we'll open the discussion afterwards. Please, Liv.
Well, thank you, Claudio, for this very warm welcome, and thank you to Elena for the very kind invitation to come and talk here to you this evening about my work in Haliartos. And the context of this talk has been a very important opportunity for me to really think about the concepts of borders and community interaction in Boeotia. I'm particularly keen on receiving feedback and questions afterwards, so I'm going to try to limit myself to around, I hope, 40 minutes, more or less, and hopefully have some interesting discussion afterwards. So while the functioning of the later Boeotian Federation is well understood through its detailed description in the section of the manuscript that we call the Hellenic Auxeringia, which describes a koinon first established in 447-6, the earlier phases, including the rise of the earlier Boeotian Federation, is much more difficult to understand. And the aim of my contribution this evening is to address community interaction in Boeotia during this formative period, and specifically from the perspective of an often conspicuously absent actor in accounts, ancient or modern, that is the polis of Haliartos in the south of the Kopais Basin. My discussion aims to highlight the importance of the archaeological evidence, and especially monumental urban architecture and religious architecture, to understand community interaction and identity formation. In due course, I will underline the importance of the amphictyones in the management of the sanctuaries that were to become federal, and the prominent place that Haliartos must have held among them. And I'm going to argue that a series of conflicts over the management and borders surrounding the cultic activities in the southern Kopais Basin would have been a key factor in the shaping of the formalized structures that eventually we come to recognize as the Boeotian Federation. And thus, cult emerges not just as a unifying factor or legitimization of Thebes' role in the koinon, as previous research has stressed, but as a source of conflict that needed resolution. How does the PowerPoint? This one? No. Okay, here we go. Okay, but let's start at the beginning. Several aspects regarding the rise of the Boeotian ethnos and eventually the koinon are well understood and not controversial. And excellent work has been done by many scholars, and it is widely accepted that the notion of shared identity as Boeotians and the existence of a geographical location, Boeotia, is expressed in our earliest sources. And despite uncertainties regarding dating, has been convincingly demonstrated that the catalogue of ships speaks to the fact that in the 7th or by the latest early 6th century BC, the Boeotians were considered a tribal unity. And helpfully summarized on the map here on the slide by Hans Beck, the catalogue illustrates the existence of a division between Boeotians and Mineans, the latter centered around Orchomenos, and the former comprising a series of smaller and larger communities, most notably Thebes, of course, and several locations that have not, or only tentatively, as you can see on the map, been identified with known historical settlements. Okay, yeah, here we go. The later federal administrative capital of Ongestos already appears as Poseidon's bright grove in the Iliad, and it's a description that is echoed in the Homeric hymn to Apollo, which further refers to horses and chariots for which the sanctuary later gathered fame, for example, described by Pindar. The Homeric hymn to Hermes also sees Hermes pass through Ongestos, the much-loved grove at grassy Ongestos. And everyone agrees that these references are certainly testifying to the importance of the sanctuary at that time. And in the Pseudohesi of the catalogue of women, we learn about the existence of an eponymous hero, Boiotos, father of Ongestos and son or father of Itonos. The later federal sanctuary of Athena, Itonia, near Coronea, is not just mentioned in written sources. Several scholars have pointed out that the festive cult of the Boeotia might already be depicted on vessels, as you can see on the slide, dated to the mid-century BC. And as we see here, the iconographic evidence refers to processions and cult activities, and references to the cult in Alkaios and Bacchylides testify to the early and supra-regional importance of the cult. And in Pindar, we learn about the existence of hippic games, paralleling the importance, of course, of horses and in cult and games in Ongestos. Also well studied are inscriptions, and I refer to the most recent work by Hans Beck and Angela Ganter, among many others, of course. And inscriptions bearing the ethnic Boeotians start appearing from the late 6th century BC onwards, famously at the Ptoion in Akrefnia, as you can see on the slides, also in Delphi and probably in Thebes. And the inscriptions also clearly speak to the fact that there was a collective at the time that called itself the Boeotians. Hans Beck and Peter Funke have suggested that the resources to host large festivals and games shared by local elites at the sanctuaries of Ongestos and the Itonion quickly exceeded the means of any individual community. And they propose that this would have led to new forms of interaction, being that of pooling resources, which eventually would help to pave the way for the formalized interaction that we know as koinon. Other scholars have stressed the role of military operations involving the Boiotoi in the early 6th century BC as a decisive factor in the formation of the Boeotian Federation. And the extensive operations against the Thessalians must indeed have required a level of inter-community organization that exceeded the level of shared cult participation. At the same time as these wars, a series of coins appear, as you see on the slide, minted on the Eginetan standard with the common obverse type of the cutout shield. Some scholars have suggested that the coinage is a clear sign of the existence of a koinon, but this has been rejected by others. And nevertheless, Emily McGill has stressed that the high level of regional integration achieved through economic interaction and standardized weights and measures certainly paved the way towards the integration into a federal structure. Moreover, a recently discovered bronze sheet from a public treasury in Thebes demonstrates the existence of the office of the Boiotarches in the late 6th, early 5th century BC, and yet another piece of evidence indeed that testifies to the complex and multi-level interaction and integration of the Boeotian communities. Also well documented is the increasingly prominent role that Thebes plays in Boeotia. This is expressed through myth, through the advance of figures like Cadmos and Heracles, who get increasingly entangled with earlier local mythological figures like Iolaos and the Alcaidai. Thebes' ambitions were not limited to the region, and the pseudo-Hesiodic shield of Heracles clearly styles Thebes as a protector of Apollo's cult in Delphi. And on the ground, we know that the Thebans successfully gained control of the Ptoion near Akrefia, and the construction of the stone temple for Apollo Ptoios in the late 6th century is seen by most as having been orchestrated by the Thebans. And by the time of the Persian Wars, the Ptoion is thought to have been successfully under their control. In 519, the Thebans tried to bully the Plataeans into the Boeotian League. And we know from inscriptions also that individual citizens from other Boeotian cities dedicated to Apollo Ismenios at Thebes, and thus at Thebes was a scene for competitive display for the regional elites. Surrounding communities were forced to participate in the ritual obligation of the Tripodophoria, the offering of tripods, which, as Nassos Papalexandrou has highlighted, can be seen as ritually ceding territory to Thebes. However, if we start to pick apart the evidence about the rise of the Boeotian koinon and the role of Thebes herein, it quickly becomes clear that there are several problems. And the actual dynamics of the various communities that constituted the Boiotoi is far from certain. For a start, our texts do not, in fact, unanimously depict a coherent group of Boeotians inhabiting a well-defined region of Boeotia. As Hans Beck has commented, there are contradictions as to where exactly Boeotia is located. According to Hesiod, Onchestos, a grove located in the Chora of Aliathos, founded by Onchestos, the son of Boiotos, who himself was the son of Poseidon. Whereas the catalogue of ships, in contrast, identifies Boeotia as the region around Thebes, including the communities north and south of the Copais Basin. The involvement of Thebes in the monumentalization of Onchestos in the 6th century BC is also far from certain. A reference to Poseidon protecting Thebes' walls in the Aspis has been put forward as evidence for Theban control over Onchestos, thus paralleling the Theban control over the Ptoia. But can we really say that an aspiration to divine protection, as expressed in the text, as you see on the slides, can we really say that that amounts to full territorial control over a cult place? I think this is too far a leap. And also Jonathan Hall has suggested that it is possible that Onchestos' early fame did not derive from any pan-Boeotian significance, but from its location on a principal route from Euboea and Attica to Delphi. Similarly, iconographical and written sources indeed indicate that the sanctuary of Athena Itonia enjoyed regional fame. However, evidence for pan-Boeotian worship at the Itoneon does not predate the late 4th century, when it became the official federal sanctuary, as confirmed by a Boeotian Aetolian proxeny decree from 301 BC. And only a source as late as Polybius is the first to mention the Pan-Boeotia festival. Pindar makes ample reference to Onchestos in Itonia. However, we can agree with Angela Ganter that it is suspicious that he mentions Theban and Boeotian festivals separately when listing the impressive victory catalogue of the Rhodian Diagoras. Indeed, she rightly observes, and I quote, "Though we can conclude that the Boeotians at this time were a cultural community identified on religious grounds, we cannot say how cults exactly worked as an integrative factor. Interpretation is often based on assumptions," end quote. And elsewhere, Angela Ganter has pointed out that our early inscriptions from the Ptoion that would attest to the existence of a well-defined ethnic group called the Boeotians are not that convincing. That among 4 possible inscriptions, 2 are not preserved, 1 does not actually even name the Boeotians, And the best example is a statue at base, which I showed on an earlier slide. It's tiny, it measures 5 by 5 centimeters. So it's not impressive at all. And this casts doubt on the importance of a shared and well-developed Boeotian identity. And moreover, the refusal of Orchomenos and possibly Haliartos in the earliest phases to participate in the cooperative coinage is striking and clearly shows that not all the Boeotians were on the same page regarding regional collaboration. And while some see Herodotus' reference, Book 5, chapter 79.2, to the oracle alluding to the Theban Amphictyones, around dwellers, as including Haliartos and thus Onchestos, this inclusion is not explicitly mentioned and therefore not sure. So this means that at least we can say that there are a lot of uncertainties surrounding the early Boeotian ethnos and koinon, and the relation between the two, as well as the role of Thebes in their development. Conspicuous absent in all discussions is what most consider to be a small sleepy polis far removed from any action, apart from an eventful day in 395 BC when Lysander died when attacking the city. In what follows, I will use the development of urban and religious architecture at Haliartos to argue for an important role of this community in the management of Onchestos and the early Boeotian ethnos. While Thebes certainly may have had his eyes on Onchestos, I believe that Haliartos and its allies tried to keep the Theban expansion at bay, and that they were successful for at least some time. I see evidence for this struggle in local myth, which through a monumentalized landscape was made tangible and provided context for the creation of community memory and identity. Next, I will suggest that it was the disagreement about borders and the management of the sanctuaries in the territory of Haliartos that led to the need for negotiation and conflict resolution between the communities involved. Haliartos is located south of the Copais Basin, as you can see on the slide. I'm not sure whether the arrow is functioning to indicate. So this was the main route between Thebes and Orchomenos, and the main route from the south of Attica towards the north, including Delphi. And in the vicinity of Haliartos, we find not one, not two, but three very important regional sanctuaries. I think I can use the mouse now. Thank you very much. So I'm, of course, talking here about the sanctuary not located for Athena Alalcomene. Here, the sanctuary, the Typhoseum, and Onchestos here. The absence of substantial literary accounts or epigraphy has led to the fact that Haliartos has been rather understudied. Some scholars have speculated about the role of Haliartos in relation to the development of Onchestos, but nobody has really elaborated on the topic. So recent research at Haliartos in the context of the Ancient Cities of Boeotia project under John Bintliff and Anthony Snodgrass provided an impetus for revising the urban development of the site. And the preparation of the publication of the Urban Architecture Survey conducted between 2016 and 2019 is underway, hopefully soon. And finally, I hear some people think. So we know Haliartos through the ages, through literature, and already Dotwell in the 19th century visited the site and commented on the excellent state of preservation of the remains in the area. And in his book, there is a depiction of a picture of a situation, which we unfortunately were unable to locate in space and probably was just an imaginary landscape inspired by the ruins of Haliartos. So previous research on Haliartos has actually been limited to two brief excavation campaigns in 1926 and 1931. And some trenches were dug in a sanctuary on the Acropolis and what was assumed at the time to be a Mycenaean gate in the fortification wall around the Acropolis. Next, Haliartos has been discussed by several scholars who talked about the well-preserved walls, mainly in terms of masonry style and chronology. And most notable here is the work of Scranton and discussions by subsequent scholars, including Fredrickson, and more recently, the comprehensive work on Greek fortifications by Hulden that you see on the slides. Recent research conducted within the Boeotia survey project resulted in new hypothetical reconstructions of the urban architecture at Haliartos. And a very detailed hypothetical map was first produced based on the results of remote sensing, as you see on the slide. It shows an outline of city walls in the south and west part of the town, Acropolis walls in the north, small part to the east, and complete southern and western edges of the Acropolis. And striking is further the density of architecture proposed for the lower town as well as the Acropolis. And a very recent geophysical survey has added much more detail by mapping what is underground. So for those who don't know what geophysics is, you scan the underground to see what's there without excavation. So that has allowed to propose a possible location for the Agora of Haliartos, the location of which was the subject of much speculation. So the earliest wall surrounding the Acropolis was traditionally classified as Mycenaean. That is the blue one. And a next one also around the Acropolis, very fragmentary, here in pink, one that was considered to be archaic. And in late classical times, the city was fortified with yet another wall, now incorporating the lower town, badly preserved, but as you see on the slide, nevertheless traceable. Further research in our project was conducted on the urban fabric in the lower town by a team under Emery Farinetti. I will not elaborate in detail on the results of the investigation, as interesting as they might be for our understanding of urbanism in the ancient Greek world. We have revised several of the chronologies and earlier reconstructions, but it would lead us too far, of course, to discuss these in detail in this venue. Relevant for our discussion today is the development of urban fortifications and their relation to the sanctuary on the Acropolis that was excavated in the early 20th century. And long believed to have been a city wall surrounding the entire Acropolis, possibly dated to the 7th century BC, these badly preserved remains in what is called by archaeologists the so-called lesbian style for the characteristic round curves, in addition to very monumental polygonal blocks, as you can see on the slide, actually belong, as our investigations have revealed, to a monumental entrance to the city. The overall plan is quite unclear, but the remains indicate that the southern side of the Acropolis was surrounded with a very monumental wall. And it is possible that an elevation of mud bricks was actually erected on top of the stone foundations. The monumental entrance incorporated the still existing Bronze Age fortification wall that surrounds the Acropolis, and the Acropolis was the location of the settlement until the late classical extension into the lower town. So on the slide, you see the very close relationship between the Bronze Age wall and the later archaic fortification. Due to the bad state of preservation, it is difficult to reconstruct a plan. However, a similar example of combination of polygonal wall construction built with the incorporation of an earlier Bronze Age wall, as we see in Haliartos, can be found in nearby Eleon. And the excavators in Eleon stress that the archaic wall was built between 550–500 BC and was done so on purpose in very close relation to the Mycenaean wall. And this needs to be seen as a conscious attempt to create a direct and manifest link to the heroic past. And we can suggest a similar motivation to be at work in Haliartos. Another very manifest example of conscious connection to the heroic past made through urban architecture can be found in Athens. careful research on the entrance to the Acropolis before the construction of the Propylaea by Harrison et al. York II shows that the Mycenaean fortification around the Acropolis was integrated in a series of gradual elaborations in the late 6th and 5th century BCE. And the expansion of the entrance to the Athenian Acropolis evolved the accentuation of the front part of the entrance through the addition of steps and terraces, which could have been used for performance acts during processions. And of course, we know that the Panathenaic festival included processions of the Acropolis, and this is famously depicted on the frieze of the later temple for Athena. Careful observations on the local topography at Haliartos betrays the presence of a series of flat surfaces, possibly belonging to terraces with a similar purpose, of course. And the recent research on the urban fabric with Emery Farinetti and her team suggests that the presumed gate, as you see on the slide, was indeed located at the main axis of the city in the street plan. While we did not conduct any excavations on this section of the wall, a date for the construction is provided by the evidence from the sanctuary that was excavated on the Acropolis. The masonry style of the entrance to the Acropolis and the monumentalization of the sanctuary is the same, indicating that both were constructed at the same time. Pottery recovered during the excavations suggests that they should be placed in the later 6th century BC. And the excavations also revealed that prior to the construction of the monumental hall and temple, the cult space was already defined through the presence of a platform, possibly an altar. And votive gifts from this period include pottery, tripod, figurines, and other. Inscriptions on sherds indicate that the sanctuary was dedicated to Athena. And most scholars have automatically assumed that this was Athena Itonia, given her important role in the later koinon. However, in the light of the community interaction that I am describing, I am not so certain about this attribution. And if any link should be made, I would suggest that this could have been Alalcomenae, who certainly had a cult place to the west of Haliartos, even though today we are not sure about the exact location, nor about its relation to the Etonion, which must have been very close. The importance of the urban monumentalization at Haliartos cannot be underestimated. Monumental urban architecture and sanctuaries have been well studied for their impact on community formation and the creation of polis identity and memory. Through urban architecture, the community was literally anchored in the heroic past and present were weaved together over and over again through performance and enactment during cult. Through this fast building project, Haliartos asserted itself in the regional landscape. And anyone using the route towards Thebes or in the opposite direction to Delphi would have been reminded about the importance and heroic claims made by this community. Crucially, the monumentalization of the sanctuary at Ongestos took place at the same time as that of Haliartos. And this is evident through the similarities in masonry style. And also excavations have revealed that the expansion of the sanctuary in the second half of the should be placed in the second half of the 6th century BC. As I outlined earlier, most scholars assume that the impetus for the monumentalization at Ongestos was given by Thebes and or the Boeotians as a joint venture. However, I am inclined to believe that it was Haliartos that took the initiative for the project. The new monumental entry to the Acropolis at Haliartos accentuated the space along the road, thus drawing the area into the Acropolis. And the route to Ongestos is highly visible. Movements such as processions would have proceeded seamlessly from Ongestos via the road into Haliartos, moving up and out on the other side of the Acropolis, where we have documented another entrance, and facing the supposed direction of the sanctuary of Athena Alalcomenae. It is highly unlikely, I think, that the Thebans and or the Boeotian ethnos would have been responsible for both the urban expansion at Haliartos as well as the sanctuary in Ongestos. In fact, we have evidence of the involvement of Haliartos in the territory of Ongestos. A Horos from the 5th century marks the border with Thebes. And a second one, it's a difficult one to understand due to its bad preservation, could be another boundary stone or a dedication. And yet another boundary stone was found on the Acropolis of Haliartos, and Rush interprets the letters as Horos Hiero, the sanctuary, in his view, being that of Athena Itonia, so the one on the Acropolis. The evidence thus clearly speaks to the practice of demarcating boundaries in and around Haliartos, as well as the latter's claim to Ongestos. Yannis Pikoulas has pointed out that boundary inscriptions often record the settlement of disputed boundaries, usually by means of a panel of foreign judges. Also, numismatic evidence suggests that it was Haliartos laying claim in the 5th century BC on Ongestos and not Thebes. We clearly see Poseidon's symbol included in Haliartos' emissions during the 5th century and up into the 4th century BC. So this would suggest that there was a conflict between Haliartos and Thebes. And in fact, I believe that we have evidence for this through mythologized conflicts placed in the heroic past. A first strand is provided by the myth of Alcmene, mother of Heracles. After her death, Alcmene supposedly lived with Rhadamanthys in exile in Ocyleia, an undetermined place near Haliartos. And Plutarch locates at Haliartos a tomb of Alcmene and Rhadamanthys, the latter who is considered to have replaced an earlier local hero, Aleas or Aleos. And already Angela Kuur has speculated about whether this myth was intended as a competition to the Theban Heracles cult, and especially against the cult place for Heracles Hippodetes, whose sanctuary was located close to Ongestos. Our investigations at Haliartos have documented the presence of what used to be a monumental tomb, you see it indicated on the slide, in the lower town of Haliartos. And even though a mound is not preserved today, the foundation has been recorded as well as a platform that served as an altar. And the dimensions of the mound, it's one of the largest known in Boeotia, indicate that this monument was very prominent and visible along the road between Thebes and Orchomenos, and thus suggests that this myth might have occupied an important place in the self-conception and cult activities at Haliartos. And further conflict surrounds the figure of Heracles, because this sanctuary to Heracles Hippodetes was built to commemorate an event in which Heracles tied up the horses and war chariots of the Orchomenians, which caused their defeat in battle. And Pausanias states that the hostile encounter between Heracles and the Menians originated from a dispute at the sanctuary of Poseidon at Ongestos, in the course of which Clymenos, the king of Orchomenos, was killed by the Thebans, and his son Erginos seeks revenge, challenges Heracles to battle. Heracles cuts off his nose and sabotages the horses, hence the commemoration of this sanctuary as a direct challenge, of course, to the hippic events in Ongestos. The theme of horses is also prominent in another series of myths linking Thebes, Orchomenos, and Haliartos together. Near the Tilphossa mountain was located in the important 6th century oracular cult place mentioned by Homer, Strabo, and Pausanias. And it's mostly known as the place where the seer Tiresias died after drinking the water from the fountain. But in the Thebaids, the fountain was associated with Poseidon and Erinis, Mycenaean deity of vengeance, and born from this encounter is a famous racehorse, Arion. And Poseidon is said to have given the horse to Copreus, the king of Haliartos. According to Hesiod, Copreus is a son of Pelops, who marries a daughter of Leucon, grandchild of Athamas of Orchomenos. So Copreus of Haliartos here links the Argive and Orchomenian front against Thebes. So this is yet another conflict between the two communities. The ancient scholiast Sophocles knew of another important interconnection between Thebes and Tilphossa. According to him, the Theban dragon that was killed by Cadmos when he founded the city originated from Tilphossa. So he reports that the creature was born to Ares and Tilphossa Erinis. Angela Kuhr has already identified this motive of dragon slaying as a representation of the ordering principle of the polis, overcoming religious representations from different times, either connected to Ge or Ares. And of course, Heracles too, he was a famous slayer of snakes and dragons. I think that we need to extend this theme to the conflict between Haliartos and Thebes more generally. There are several indications that a snake or dragon-like creature representing earlier chthonic cult dwelled in the Haliartida. Homer's Athena Alakomenes appears in the Iliad with the epithet Tritogeneia, which relates to Pausanias' Greek Triton. And Triton, of course, is depicted with a dragon-like tail. The Tilfossa fountain was also a place of snake worship, according to Pausanias. From the Itonion, we have a lecane. It's the same one, actually, as I showed earlier. The lecane depicting Athena next to a snake, as you see here on the slide. A snake or another chthonic animal on a pedestal. And the creature clearly represented a cult image. Pausanias and Strabo say that the bronze cult statue of Athena Itonia stood beside Zeus or Hades, respectively. And provided that both authors saw the same pair of images, Hans Beck suggests that it is quite likely that a non-anthropomorphic depiction of Athena's companion presented an early foreigner to them. From Haliartos itself, we have Pausanias reporting that on the Acropolis, there was a sanctuary for Cecrops, which possibly can be linked to a Bronze Age absidial structure that we have documented. Was actually excavated by the Ephoria, but never published, but still visible today and recorded during our urban architecture survey. So many scholars consider this presence of Cecrops to be a late invention linked to the Athenian possession of the Haliarton territory after destruction by the Romans. However, the fact that Cecrops is also depicted with a snake-like tail, I am inclined to believe that also here we are facing an earlier existing tradition of chthonic cult, pairing Athena with a chthonic deity, as we know from Coronea. Also, Plutarch actually links a dragon to Haliartos, as you see quoted on the slide. So therefore, it can be suggested that the recurrent theme of dragon and snake slaying by Cadmos and Heracles mythologizes a conflict of the Haliartida region with Thebes. So what does this all mean? We see a large project of monumentalization of several sanctuaries and the urban fortification in and around Haliartos in the second half of the 6th century BC. Soon after, we have evidence in the form of horoi that demarcate the territory and that can be considered as a resolution to conflict, something which we also see abundantly reflected in local myth. So why did this happen and who was involved? It has already been suggested that the project of monumentalization of Onchestos would have been beyond the means of any one polis and that therefore Thebes or the Boeotian koinon would have been involved. I do agree that it is very likely that resources were pooled, and I believe that we need to look in the direction of the around dwellers or amphictyones. We have quite a few references to amphictyones, and both the sanctuaries at Onchestos and the Itonion are believed to have been managed by amphictyones. Again, archaeology provides us with some clues. The ancient cities of Boeotia survey has located what they consider to be a striking amount of settlements in the territory of Haliartos, dated to the early Iron Age and archaic to classical periods. And I sincerely thank John Bindley for making a preliminary map on the slides available with unpublished results for the use of my presentation today. The pottery was studied by Vladimir Stisi and Anna Mainz. In nearby Thespias, the population is believed to have lived in a dispersed settlement cluster, or different clusters in the countryside, before moving to an urban center in the 5th century BC. So I propose that this multitude of communities formed a dense network of interaction through participation in cults at various places in the surrounding landscape. A large number of settlements is also reflected in the catalogue of ships, where a series of smaller centers is listed. Even though these do not necessarily correspond to the settlements discovered, the abundance of names makes forging links easy and malleable enough to claim heroic ancestry as listed in the catalogue. Furthermore, and despite criticism from some scholars who believe the Boeotian ethnos and koinon to be late developments, I am inclined to believe that these networks of interaction stretch far back in time. Some forms of interaction eventually became formalized into structures that we call ethnos and koinon, issuing laws and decrees. But the absence of these in earlier times does not mean that there was no community interaction or politics. At the sanctuary on the Haliartan Acropolis, the lack of a tripod was found associated with the earlier phase of the sanctuary before it was monumentalized. It was dated to the 7th century BC. So well known from Thebes, as was discussed by Nassos Papalexandrou, the dedication of tripods should be seen as a symbolic way of surrendering of territory to Thebes. Of course, we do not know who dedicated tripods as Haliartos, but in the light of the practice being known in the region, it is possible that we see similar dynamics at play. And it is possible that the around dwellers of Haliartos were coerced into paying up to the Haliartans, or maybe they sought protection, or maybe they were simply paying their respects to this community with a venerable heroic past. We do not know how Haliartos was affected by the Bronze Age collapse, which, as we know, significantly affected both Thebes and Orchomenos. It could be possible that in this vacuum at the end of the Bronze Age and in the early Iron Age, smaller places like Haliartos provided more of a continuum, which would explain the importance of what's a secondary site in historical times and the clustering of all these important sanctuaries in its territory. My proposed reconstruction, therefore, revisits some assumptions about the rise of the Boeotian ethnos and koinon. I believe community interaction in the southern Kopais, possibly starting in the early Iron Age, to have centered on the participation in shared cults. Within this network, some centers develop into hubs where elites of the around dwellers meet and compete in dedication and athletic competition. A following Hesiod, this group can be linked to the region of Onchestos and the communities residing around it, including Haliartos. And the Boeotoi, in one of their earliest collective dedications that survive, made an offering to Athena Tritogenia at Delphi. And Homer's Athena Alcamenes appears in the Iliad with the epithet Tritogenea. So the sanctuary is to be located in the territory of Haliartos, demarcating the other boundary in the west. So gradually we see Thebes moves to the fore and tries to obtain a more prominent role. They directly assault their neighbors and appear to successfully increase their influence in the Ptoion. Attempts to gain control over Onchestos is contested, and the evidence presented here suggests that a conflict with the Haliartans erupted. The evidence of horoi, which are some of the earliest horoi we know from ancient Greece altogether, suggests that structures to negotiate formal resolutions to border conflicts were developed. And in fact, also at Akrefia, we have evidence of the existence of similar conflict resolutions. And therefore, I propose that the conflict over borders and the management of regional sanctuaries, confronted with Thebes' ambitions, became a sphere in which community interaction moved from ethnos to koinon. We certainly have evidence from later periods that border conflicts were brought before the koinon. And by the later 4th or early 3rd century BC, Coronea and Lebadia were implicated in a dispute over their borders surrounding the sanctuary of Trophonios. And the subsequent judgment was carved into a round limestone column that demarcated the boundary. And the koinon decreed that the border should run along the water flowing from the altar of Zeus on top of the ridge. Also, Emily McKill has suggested that the resolution of some of the armed conflicts in the 6th century BC led directly to the production of the earliest coins. The Boeotian koinon, thus, I propose, should be seen as a complex and overlapping network of interactions rising out of a long tradition of community interaction involving inconspicuous members like Haliartos. Thank you.
Thank you, Liv, for these stimulating insights into Boeotian archaeology. You made a dialogue. You created an interplay between, of course, archaeological sources, material culture, but also written sources and so on. And I have a lot of, I'm interested particularly on this elaboration, in these elaborations of mythological, literary elaboration of what archaeology should show us, particularly regarding this, I don't know, how can I call it, a tumulus or just a tomb of Alcmena. Probably I will ask you later if you could elaborate a bit more on this, showing us or giving us some hints about what you really found there. And I don't know, but I open now the discussions, both here in the room and of course as usual online. If there are any questions or remarks, curiosities or something like that, you can just raise the hands and intervene in our conversation about Haliartos, Onkestos, and at the end, Liv's presentation. Please.
Maybe while people think about this, I'll say a few more words about tumulus. We were struck, in fact, so we discovered a structure which is not really discussed in any of the previous archaeological works, and really scratching our heads about what this could be, because it's really enormous. I would have to look up, but I believe it's 42 meters in diameter, which is really huge. And of course, we know about several tumuli in the area, or Orchomenos, also in Thebes. So, of course, our initial idea was that this was probably a Bronze Age tomb, but the mount was no longer visible. So initially, we were even questioning whether it was actually a tumulus. But I found one reference in a 19th century German scholar visited the site and clearly describes a tomb, and he was German, so very very detailed in his description, and it is exactly where our tomb is located, and he describes the mount. So it was still present in the 19th century. It was a tomb in the 19th century, but somewhere in between it was dug up. We don't know by whom. It might have been that it was effectively excavated by the Ephoria, who dug several trenches, so also in the around the sanctuary, behind the sanctuary. And this Bronze Age hut that I showed also was found in a trench dug by the Ephoria. It's very characteristic, as you see on the aerial photos, like cross-shaped trenches. So we don't know whether it was excavated. But then actually the description in Plutarch, in the Genio Socrates, he talks about the Spartans digging up the tomb for Alcmene. And actually, so according to the text, this is something that would have happened during the occupation, so 4th century BCE. And the foundation of the tumulus, as we documented, shows technique that was typical also for the houses. And the houses we know very well, this kind of urban pattern in the lower towns is very characteristic, not just for Boeotia, but we see it all over the Greek world, a regular street pattern. So that's very typical for starting late classical period, early Hellenistic period. So we have a reconstruction of the tomb dating to that period. And actually, the story goes that the Spartans dug up the tomb and they found inscribed remains, which next they send to the priests in Egypt, and it comes back and it's a message from Heracles and things like that. Very interesting. Actually, the earliest documented excavation in Greece in our sources. But then they have floodings in the city, and they are told by the oracle to rebuild a tomb. And I think what we see is the rebuilding. They made it very big with a foundation and with an altar. But this is an indication, I think, that there was an earlier tomb present.
Historical. Particular.
No, that doesn't say. It doesn't.
Okay.
No, it's not. It's not specific. Well, there are many oracles around. It could be one of the nearby oracles, or they could have gone to Delphi. We don't know. It's not specified at all. But it's very interesting. Of course, there's a reference in several of the other sources to the presence of tombs all around. This is the only one we have found. So. Yeah, others might be destroyed or maybe never existed. So, but some sources have also linked the tomb to Lysander. But I think, and as all of you know, how malleable landscapes are and how through time different myths get attached to the same monument to serve a specific social and cultural context at the time. So I think that's definitely a process that was at work there.
Thank you, Liv. Thank you. So I invite you to pose your question if there are any. Probably Jeremy. I see the.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, of course. Please.
Great, thanks. Liv, thank you. That was really enlightening. There was a huge amount in there that was fantastic. My question is on a small detail, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit about words, about the meaning of haliartos, how you interpret that, and also having a local hero called Coprius seems to require a little bit of attention. Can you say anything about either of those?
Actually, no, that's a very good question. I haven't thought about that. So can you elaborate on the nature of your question?
Well, in terms of haliartos, I was wondering whether we should be thinking of it in terms of halia as in a meeting place for people, or whether it's to do with if there would be, some evidence for salt production in the area, but that I think is less likely. But I think it deserves some attention. If it is a meeting place, if it's from halia, as in the Doric sense of a meeting place, it would point to an interesting possibility of it being a place where different communities on the southern edge of the Capaeus were meeting. And as for Coprius, why you have an early king called King Shit, I don't know.
Yeah.
And he's also famous, I think, for his battles with Kyknos, the Swan Man. So there's something vaguely elemental or animalistic going on there, but it's from a layer of myth that I don't pretend to understand.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Thank you for your observation on the name of Haliartos. Really interesting. I don't know of any salt production. Has never occurred in any of our discussions, so I also don't think that Boeotia survey has found any evidence. It's sweet water, so it's not salt water. So
Exactly.
I
That's why I think it's more likely the former.
Yeah, and of course it makes complete sense, because the way I read the archaeological evidence is really an existence of several communities that exist, interact with each other, and then you have the one Haliartos that already has these remains. So this Bronze Age wall remains functioning up until it is mostly destroyed by the Romans. So a community with a tumulus, so they can lay claim, they have prestige. And I think therefore start for some time to play an important role until Thebes, of course, comes and tries to take it away. Interesting observation about Copreus. I haven't really thought about that. I'll have to do some thinking and get back to you. I confess that there are some loose strands in the mythology that I don't really have an answer for the moment. It's incredibly complex. There's so many myths and references and changes, and it's not so easy to wrap your head around all of them. And yeah, I'm not sure I'm even going to be able to say something sensible about all of them. But I am going to think about that, and if I come up with a solution, I'll let you know.
Could I follow up with one more question?
Go ahead.
If I may be allowed. There's something interesting going on in this part of Greece in relation to cults of heroines and mothers, and I'm thinking particularly of Antiope, because her cult spot is used as a point of negotiation between the Phocians and the Boeotians. And I think Alex Knodell has uncovered a cave dedicated to Antiope in the borderlands up on Mount Catharon, and in the borderlands between Boeotia and Attica. So it seems to me to have a really major prominent cult of the mother of Heracles would really fit with a broader practice in the region.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Angela Kuur has speculated on, when we should date this attribution to Alcmene. I agree, and I do see this pattern recurring. You have this chthonic component in the area, and a female figure that I think through time becomes identified as Athena, but maybe historically was a more local figure. But that indeed, in absence of any written sources, is very difficult to really document. But it is indeed a recurring pattern. So yeah, it makes complete sense, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I don't know if there are some other questions, both online and in presence here. Roy van Beek. Please, Roy. Hi.
Hi, Lieve. Thank you for your paper. I'll quickly say maybe concerning the mythological king that Salvatore Tufano's work might be helpful. I'm not completely sure if you've checked it, but he has dug into any local story that you can find in Boeotia, so maybe that will at least help you out with finding out if there's more to this king that there could be. And the only thing, my Aeolian or Aeolic isn't that great, but I'm not sure if with Haliartos there's an issue with because Jeremy said it is related to Doric, and I'm not sure how that would work here, but I'll leave it to philologists to correct me and probably eviscerate me when I'm offline. I just had a different question regarding I think you're right about Algestos that it doesn't necessarily need to be a Theban location. And I was wondering if you, to drag in a completely different sanctuary, if you thought about the Kabirion in this sense as well, because it's sort of located between Thebes and Thespiae, but also not too far from Haliartos, and whether this might be fit into this sort of strip of land of sanctuaries, as it were, for negotiatory practices between groups. But I know it's a very vague and wide question, but I was just trying to pick your mind over that.
I confess that I haven't thought about that. I haven't looked at it. I do think actually that the Thebans were more successful in establishing themselves on other sides of their territory. I think it was specifically Haliartos that was more successful to put up a fight and protect his area of influence. But I confess that I would have to study each case separately in depth, which I haven't done. I mean, Haliartos was already such a huge challenge to wrap my head around. So I'm not going to claim that I have solved all the regional problems in terms of negotiation. I wish, not this time. But yeah, I do think that the existence of the different communities as documented through archaeology is really something important, and that we need to include in our discussions more than sometimes has happened, because scholars tend to limit themselves in some cases to, you know, written evidence, inscriptions, and then of course you need an archaeologist to say something about the importance of physical remains that might challenge or confirm certain ideas. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think something similar to Thespiae occurs in Thebes, but much earlier. So I think you have a similar pattern with the spread out small settlements sort of clustering together into a bigger city. So it would be interesting to see if something similar happens with Haliartos as a way of rebuffing the Thebans. I think I'm a bit careful always trying to overestimate the bad guy role for the Thebans in Boeotia, although they are pretty much the bad guy in most cases. But I was wondering how that would work in Algestos, maybe, like, because I think that the recent excavations also uncovered a smaller settlement near Algestos, right? So I don't know if it maybe emerges as a very small local sanctuary that gradually gets this, with larger neighbors clawing their way in, or if it's, or am I maybe misinterpreting because I'm not an archaeologist, so hence I was curious how much you know if that might be something to look into, that it's like it grows towards it,
Yeah,
as it
well,
were.
I do see all the elites, including the Thebans, as participating in each other's cult practices. So there's actually a small shirt. It's something, you know, that I haven't quite solved yet, not in the least because I haven't actually seen the shirt in question. It's just in the with bad pictures in the early 20th century publication, but it is by Austin, the excavator, described as something odd. And I am thinking that maybe there are parallels in the recently discovered geometric pottery of Thebes. So that would hint at links also with Thebes. So I do think that all these communities interacted and participated together, but that they agreed to be all on the same level. And that is where the disagreement rose, because I think that Thebes tries to place itself in a more prominent position. And that's where the others say, no, we don't like that. These sanctuaries are for everyone, for all the elites. And you know, we know probably that they participated in the Ptoion as well. So everyone is moving around this landscape, participating, competing. But then disagreement arises as to who is actually the boss over the situation. So a ambition of the team against local communities.
Yeah, I'll say one thing and I'll stop. I think like the last thing you said, I think that really fits in with the Daphne by Pindar, because they stress so much that they're good neighbors. And I think especially in the context of the recent Archemenian revolt, as it were, against the Athenians, that is maybe exactly stressing that they're being friendly, rather they finally understand how to get on with their neighbors, as it were, rather than trying to impose it. But I'll stop here, because otherwise I'll just take over.
Thank you.
Questionnaire. Anyway, thanks for your paper again.
So thank you, Roy. Other remarks, questions, suggestions? So I just take a couple of minutes just to stress a point you touch on during your presentation. So the topic of the three horoi of Haliartos, it's very interesting for us because the boundary stones, because what you said is that this horoi presuppose a kind of conflicts before, so they were set up theoretically, if I correctly understand, they were set up after, of course, after a conflict situation or something like that. We have to distinguish, of course, the quality, let's say, of the horoi. One horos of a city is not the same of a horos, but can you?
Yeah, well, that was not my suggestion, but other scholars have suggested this. It's not my original idea, but I do see that it fits the pattern. I would say so. We have the archaeology and the horoi, and also the mythological level of conflict that has not really been discussed much in previous scholarship. So if there was just one horos and nothing else, I would say, okay, difficult to understand. But the fact that there are different pieces of evidence, at least in my reading, pointing in the same direction, makes me inclined to look at the level of conflict. The precise dynamics, of course, escape us. But I do think that this is one of the occasions of interaction between these communities to negotiate solutions, because they realize that everyone wants to participate in the sanctuary. And it seems here, at least in my reading, that Haliartos was allocated the management and the influence on Ongestos, at least until the 4th century, of course, when they have to be saved by the Thebans in the advent of a Spartan assault. So, yeah. I'm not an epigraphist, so I will leave it. I will leave it to the specialists to say something more about that. But I find it also very interesting that it's some of the earliest horoi that we have. I looked them up, and has been published. We have, very few from 7th and 6th century. A little bit more in the 5th century, but most horoi that we have are later. So that shows that there's a practice that is existing, I would say developed, first, or one of the earliest situations in which this kind of demarcation is developed in the Greek world, which I find very interesting and indicative for the complexity of interaction between the communities in this region. So we have, in the coinage and the wars and the cults and the negotiation of borders. It's a very, very complex level of interaction. So that is really this complexity, I think, that gives way eventually into a structure that becomes very formalized as koinon. But you need several years or decades or maybe even centuries of interaction before communities really start deciding on formalizing and creating offices and writing things down, writing procedures down. It just takes time to develop.
Thank you, Liv. Are there any other questions? If not, I propose to close this session. Luis no, it's just to make you congrats for your paper, I suppose. Yeah. And I propose to close our session today, but not without mentioning again our next appointment with FeBinars, the last one before the summer break, let's say. So our next speaker will be Adolfo Domínguez Monedero of the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid on June the 6th with a lecture on internal and external borders in Epiro. So we will see in 2 weeks approximately. Thank you for being with us, and we will see very soon. Bye.